difficulties. There it is. Unfortunately, we won't really have a lot of time to try to troubleshoot technical problems with you. So what we ask often is work for 95% of the issues. If you can log out and rejoin the webinar, that often fixes things. We also have French language interpretation offered by the wonderful Gabrielle. I'm just going to call on Gabrielle to introduce themselves and to provide kind of the information about how that works.
Thank you, Alex. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabriel. Today for the meeting, you'll see that closed captions in English are offered right on the Zoom meeting. So you can activate that by clicking CC, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct, Alex?
Sorry, say that again.
Are the closed captions available in English as well?
They're just available in English, unfortunately. Zoom doesn't have the dual function. So if you do want the closed captioning, you just have to click into the, should be the bottom kind of right-ish area tab button that you can click to get the English CC. And then my colleagues have just popped in the Google Docs that you're going to be using for the French transcription.
Yeah, so I'll just say that in French as well for French speakers. So, donc les sous-titres directement sur Zoom sont offerts seulement en anglais. Moi, je vais faire la traduction simultanée pendant la présentation. Dans le fond, je traduis simultanément à partir d'un Google Doc qui est à l'extérieur du meeting. Il y a un lien dans le chat. Si vous voulez cliquer, vous pouvez suivre directement à mesure que je traduis pour tout le texte de la présentation. Merci. Thank you.
Merci, Gabriel. Ensuite, we'll go through an acknowledgement of the territories. So as the National Safer Supply Community of Practice, all of us actually work in different parts across the country, as do our community members. And so we're really coming together today as well here on this webinar, as I can see almost 150 attendees. We're really coming from different places across Turtle Island. And so we really want to acknowledge that we're people who live on treaty lands and unceded territories. We also work in a sector or an industry whose goal is to address these social harms. And so we must recognize that the production of these harms comes from a long history and continued history of colonialization and colonialism. And these are really endured in the practices, institutions, and ways of thinking. And I would even also expand that to the industry of harm reduction and how it tends to reproduce some of those practices as well. Colonialism is sadly with us today. It's alive and well, and we must commit to working in ways that reshape these institutions and practices to repair harms and prevent future harms from happening, to work towards a more inclusive and just future. When I read this, I also want to bring in a bit of nuance in the sense that we're all, as I said, located in different parts. For myself personally, I'm located in Georgiagate, or so-called Montreal, and also am a registered social worker. And so to really sort of bring that nuance to our thinking, sort of when we bring up acknowledging territories, to try to think of our own place and space and what that means to be acknowledging territories. So if you haven't heard of us, we'll give you a very, very brief kind of overview of what the National Safer Supply Community of Practice does. We are funded as many programs across the country by Health Canada's Substance Use and Addictions program, so the SUOP program. Our goal is to ultimately support the scaling up and the expansion of safer supply programs across the country. And we're going to be doing this through a lot of capacity building and knowledge exchange. Our focus certainly is a medical model, so prescriptions that are provided by prescribers that are explicitly delivered via a harm reduction and public health approach. I say this also while explicitly stating that we also support and advocate for non-medical models as well as decriminalization. What we offer through the National Safer Supply Community of Practice, you're welcome to check out our website. We do a whole ton of events, workshops, webinars like this. We also offer a bunch of tools and guidance. We have a consultation line for prescribers. There's so much. I just encourage you to go to the website and see what we have to offer you. So with that said, I'm going to introduce our topic of the day. Why are we talking about emotional harm reduction? And why are we asking Corey to come and speak to us about it? I think the first thing that needs to be said is it's really an emerging terminology, right? So it's sort of an old concept, but kind of with a new spin to it. And so today is really firstly about understanding what it is and how we can and why we should be practicing this on a daily basis. I think the basic of the concept acknowledges that grief and trauma are inevitable, are unavoidable in the harm reduction movement. And of course, because of failed drug policies. And there is an importance of acknowledging and navigating our own grief and trauma. And I also want to add a little bit of nuance, and I think, Corey, you're going to add an amazing amount of nuance here around recognizing that this language of self-care and resiliency has really been co-opted and used as sort of like tools of oppression in the field of harm reduction, and sort of like how do we navigate that? And yeah, I think Corey will work us through sort of like how do we practice emotional harm reduction on a more personal level, but how do we also practice it on a more interpersonal, organizational, and institutional level. So with that, Corey, I think I'll just turn it over to you and I'll let you introduce yourself, if that's okay. All right. Oh, and sorry, before you start, I should start talking. There will be a couple of activities throughout. So there'll be 3 opportunities where we really welcome folks to be writing in the chat. And so that'll be very obvious when Corey starts to share his slides. And so we really encourage you to engage with us via the chat. Okay, I will stop sharing. And Corey, you should be able to share your screen now.
All right, well, hopefully everyone can hear me. Everyone can see the slides. We have liftoff. That is great. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are today. I will start off today by admitting that I'm feeling a little anxious. This is a different type of webinar, and Alex, you did an excellent job giving some preface to the matter, but it is a novel concept, or at least a new spin on an old concept. And a lot of this has to do with reflection. It has to do with your personal reflection. It has to do with me reflecting on my practice and how I move about through this work. And so I appreciate this opportunity. I really want to thank everybody for joining us today for emotional harm reduction. My name is Corey Ranger. I am a registered nurse and the clinical nurse lead for AVI Health and Community Services and Solid Safe Supply project here in so-called Victoria. The Victoria Safer Initiative is a federally funded, flexible and harm reduction model for the provision of pharmaceutical alternatives to the toxic drug supply. And if you joined us last month for Safe Supply 101, then you are already well aware of the program. If you didn't, hey, how come? What gives? If you missed it, or if you missed the incredible Uprooting Medical Violence webinar from Dr. Nanki Rai, you can visit the National Safe Supply Community of Practice webpage and check under the resource tab for the recorded webinars. I really view these webinars as a series of complementary conversations, important ones that, if anything else, should force us to reflect on our own practices, on our power, our privilege, and of the tools of oppression that are deeply embedded within the way we operate on a daily basis. I want to thank the National Safe Supply Community of Practice for allowing me to speak with all of you today. It is my hope that we see more webinars and trainings from people other than myself, particularly from people who use drugs, from women and gender diverse people, from Black, Indigenous, people of color. These conversations, especially the ones that are formed on the backdrop of the racist and colonial drug war, cannot happen with those most deeply affected by deadly policy not being at the table. I'm also the president of the Harm Reduction Nurses Association, and I sit on the board for the HIV Legal Network. My career in nursing has seen me working in the downtown cores of Edmonton, Calgary, and Victoria. And in addition to working in harm reduction, I've also worked as an instructor for nursing at Medicine Hat College, teaching mental health and community health nursing. Before I move on and further into today's presentation, I would like to acknowledge that there is an inseparable link between colonization and the topics that we're here to discuss today, namely the war on people who use drugs in the country commonly referred to as Canada. The impacts of this war started and upheld for the purposes of control, surveillance, and oppression are far-reaching and span generations. I am an uninvited white settler on stolen lands of the Lokungan and Wasanich peoples, and I'm incredibly privileged to live and work in these lands. A land acknowledgement is not enough to reconcile all the harms brought on by colonization and racism. but it is a continued commitment to collaborate, listen, and mobilize our privilege to help uplift voices who are not afforded the power and platforms that many of us experience. The impact of toxic drug policy on local Indigenous communities here on Vancouver Island are devastating and unacceptable. And that's really all that we have to say about that, is that not enough has been done, and that we continue to need to see more efforts and more work done to uproot the very colonial tactics that we continue to see on the war on drugs. I also want to acknowledge that this presentation, the work that I do, the work that many of you do, is made possible by people with lived and living experience of drug use, of substance use, and of them sharing their knowledge and experience with folks like myself. Much of what I've learned has come from getting direct feedback from people with lived and living experience, and it's without their generosity that this presentation would be impossible. In fact, it's without their generosity and without their ability and willingness to take risk in the absence of people with power taking risk, we wouldn't have things like needle exchange programs, take-home naloxone programming, supervised consumption services, or safe supply. Today, we're going to discuss some incredibly challenging topics. Truthfully, you cannot talk about emotional harm reduction without discussing the harms themselves. I want everyone to know that if you're struggling, if you're exhausted, if you feel like you're in the midst of a never-ending crisis, and if you're feeling helpless in all the chaos and dismay, that's actually okay to not be okay. And while I know this because nothing about the work that we do is actually okay. You're engaging in radical love and community care, scrambling to keep people you care about safe. And it's not okay because we shouldn't have to be here to begin with. We shouldn't have to rationalize the need to decriminalize people who use drugs. We shouldn't have to convince people to care about overdose. None of this is okay. If the content of today's presentation starts to feel overwhelming, I encourage you to take a break or even know that it's always okay to leave. The last thing this presentation should do is elicit more stress or anxiety. I told a friend several months ago that I thought my nervous system was shot. I'm going to share some of my experiences with you today, but I'm going to do my best to avoid dumping out my personal bag of trauma on your coffee table and rooting around to find some shiny gems. I'm going to share with you what started me down the road of talking about emotional harm reduction. And to begin with that, I'm going to read the article that I wrote that started this whole thing. How do you safeguard your heart and mind from the devastation of the fentanyl poisoning crisis? In the wake of countless preventable deaths, how do you stay afloat? What is emotional harm reduction and how do I survive in this sector? I was originally asked to cover this topic for the Drug Hub, and the irony is that I myself am not doing particularly well of late. Shortly after taking the assignment, we here in Victoria lost a pillar of harm reduction in the community, someone who was so loved and cared for that I could feel the collective grief surge as the news hit social media. Another face in my mental slideshow, another beautiful human with hopes and dreams killed by toxic drug policy. At times, I am numb to the losses. It's almost as if someone has taken a lighter to my nerve endings, and I feel as though that I'm sad because I'm unable to feel sad anymore. So, as you can tell, I'm coming to you today with a confluence of feelings. That was just an excerpt, the start of that article. And many of you may be able to relate when you look at the slide that I have up on the screen here. And the complexities of the work that we do, we often cycle through a myriad of emotions in any given day, hour, or even moment to moment. Take the time today as we discuss emotional harm reduction and reflect on how you're arriving at this presentation today. So today we're going to be talking about emotional harm reduction. We're going to be talking about what it is. We're going to be talking about things that you can do to address the immediate anxiety and worry that comes with this work. But we're also going to talk about why, in fact, this work is so traumatic and why it is so hard. And what can we do as a team? What can we do within our organization? What can we do even from addressing systems level oppression that can help mitigate the harms of this work, that can help reduce the harms of the war on drugs and help safeguard ourselves so that we can continue to do this work and we can continue to keep each other safe. On the left, you'll see my screen cover on my phone. This is the person that I wish I could emulate on a daily basis. The idea that you can recharge like a battery, set healthy boundaries, unplug from the work, and generally keep your heart and mind safe from repeated psychological injury. The truth is that I'm a bit of a shit show. See the image to the right. I am not your guide to better self-care, nor would it be appropriate for me to play that role. This is more of a field guide on a new concept developed through hard lessons and excellent mentors that I have had the privilege of working with. If you Google emotional harm reduction, you'll see that there isn't a whole lot there. In fact, the article that I wrote is there. And then other than that, there isn't a whole heck of a lot. Earlier on in my career, I was warned by so many people to slow down, to be careful, to set better boundaries, to practice mindfulness, and to stave off the dreaded burnout. I was so defiantly resistant to these conversations that it made me defensive. Scratch that, it still does make me defensive, as if burnout is some kind of emotional Beetlejuice that if we say it too many times, we'll actually conjure it in physical form. But now I have experienced burnout myself, and some of you may have also. I've actually experienced it on several occasions. And I would love, through the work that we're doing here today, from the conversations that we're having today, to help other people learn from my mistakes, and in doing so, avoid what is truly an awful experience. My last disclaimer, and arguably the most important, is that my experiences are laden in privilege. I am a white cis heterosexual male, and I check off a great number of privilege boxes. For that reason, I'm going to be speaking to you today from my personal experience, from my experience as a nurse, from my experience working as a behavioral health consultant, and from what people who use drugs, women and gender diverse people, Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, and people of color have generously shared with me. I will not, however, try to speak from those perspectives. People who use drugs, especially those who are targets of racism, discrimination, misogyny, and toxic masculinity, need to have those spaces made for them, and they certainly don't need me pretending like I get it. At the onset of the pandemic, I found myself working as a project manager for the Provincial Peer Training Project on behalf of the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions. And I took a leave of absence so that I could support some of the work that was happening in the homeless encampments that had been established in Victoria. And immediately, took a leave of absence and wanted to support because there was such a lack of supports. And many of you may empathize with that, because here in harm reduction, we're always working at a deficit, and we're always trying to make up for lack of resources, lack of supports. And I remember working in this backdrop and being so frustrated and angry with the system that it took, 7 days before clean water was provided to people. It took up to 17 days before people had access to showers. It took over 37 days before people had access to laundry services. And on top of that, we saw a significant shift in the drug supply here in Victoria and abroad in the rest of Canada. And that was that it became more volatile and it became more dangerous for people. There was an increase in the concentration of fentanyl, but there was also an increase in the volatility and the adulteration of other substances, including benzodiazepines and benzo analogs like etizolam. And so we saw a huge increase in overdoses. And at one point in time, over Check Week in April, we had 28 overdoses occur in the week just in the one park. And unfortunately, we weren't able to save everyone. We weren't able to keep everybody safe, and we weren't able to keep everyone alive. I slept in a hotel across the street from the park and acted on call. At one point in time, a nurse from a different organization complained and said that the camps felt unsafe and all of the clinical services were pulled from the camp. The despair that I saw and the way people were treated was too much to process. I sat on emergency operations center calls and listened to people with power dither on their processes and delay when they should be acting. This is when I started to experience my first bout of burnout. And since that moment, I've probably flirted with disaster upwards to 10 times. And in one unfortunate instance, I actually had to take off work for a month. I remember when I first experienced anxiety, and I actually didn't know what was happening to me. And this was early on in my nursing career. And I actually found myself in the emergency department, and a doctor handed me a magazine on mindfulness. And I actually still have this magazine today, and it had all kinds of little mantras like the health benefits of eating slowly or simple ways to unplug. I was incredibly upset when that magazine was handed to me. And what's really important today is that we make sure that we're not engaging in some of those self-care and resiliency tropes. It is not, in fact, about getting people to be better at dealing with traumatic situations. It is trying to ameliorate those situations so that we don't have to deal with it as often, and to reduce the severity of those situations when they're unavoidable. In fact, when we move on to talk about what emotional harm reduction is, then you'll understand while concepts of mindfulness are valuable, especially in self-regulation, the keys to sustaining yourself in this work cannot be so superficial. In the last webinar that we had, we spoke about different approaches to harm reduction. And the reason why we're reviewing this information today is because emotional harm reduction is actually still harm reduction. And the same principles that we apply to the work must be applied to ourselves, to our coworkers, the organizations that we work for, and the systems we exist within. You will recall in the past, and probably in other presentations that you've seen about harm reduction, that a lot of us work in this sector because we have some kind of personal connection to the work, whether it is a distant connection or a personal experience with loss or personal experience with substance use and mental health. A lot of us arrive at this work because we are tied to it intrinsically. We often talk about harm reduction at its core, about acknowledging risk and mitigating the harms thereof. You will have undoubtedly heard someone say, look, every day people take risks. And life and risk-taking behavior occurs on a continuum from low risk to high risk. When you get into a vehicle, you put on a seatbelt to mitigate that risk. It's a very common thing that we talk about in harm reduction. Well, in the case of emotional harm reduction, the risk is actually working in harm reduction. In essence, there are harms that are going to be unavoidable. We experience loss, we experience grief, we experience tragedy. This is part of the risk of doing the work. And in essence, we need to do this work, but it's also laden with all of this loss. And it's tenfold if you're a person with lived and living experience. It's also laden with stigma and divisiveness. And you can't even post online about harm reduction without some dude attacking you. However, we also reviewed the 9 principles of harm reduction that were compiled and adapted by the Harm Reduction Coalition in the United States and Harm Reduction International. And we do that because whether you're someone with personal experience of substance use or you're coming to this work without that personal experience, it's the values of harm reduction that can often unite us in solidarity. And that's key to the health and future of harm reduction as a movement and as a practice that's rooted in our hearts and not just in our heads. The reason why we are reviewing these principles today is because we will be reflecting on different ways to implement emotional harm reduction by linking back to the core principles. So these principles include drug use is a human behavior that many people across the world are unwilling or unable to stop. The second principle is that people who use drugs do not lose their rights due to their drug use. Number 3, people use drugs for many different reasons and in many different ways. Number 4, harm reduction is evidence-based. Number 5, harm reduction is committed to meeting people where they are at without judgment. Number 6, options for prevention, care, and treatment must be evidence-based, high quality, and non-coercive. Number 7, people who use drugs must be involved in designing, implementing, and evaluating programs and policies that serve them. And number 8, it's rooted in a commitment to social justice. And finally, number 9, harm reduction challenges policies and practices that cause harm. So what is emotional harm reduction? Well, we're going to start off by talking about what it isn't. Has this ever happened to you? Hey, sounds like you're going through a really tough time. How are you going to set some better workplace boundaries? How are you going to carve out some time for yourself? What can I do to support you? Careful now, it's a trap. Yes, self-care and resiliency language are easily manipulated to become tools of oppression. It's a neat way to reframe hardships on the person experiencing it. It's also incredibly short-sighted, as many of the people you work alongside aren't being resourced well enough to engage in mainstream models of self-care. Don't get me wrong, it's okay if some of these things do work for you. It's also okay if your self-care is eating a pint of ice cream, smoking a joint, doing a hoot, or taking a shot. In fact, your self-care can only be defined by you, and whether others view it as maladaptive or not is not, it's up to you to decide whether that's helpful. So friends, it's not about what we're here to discuss today. This is the kind of mainstream ways that people would look at self-care. The slide is actually titled "What Emotional Harm Reduction Isn't," and that's because my experiences with burnout and trauma, vicarious trauma, grief, and loss wasn't something that could be remedied by any of the things that you see on the screen here. In fact, it isn't something that can be remedied, but we can learn to lessen the harms, to seek solidarity, to challenge the very systems that generate harms, or simply make the work harder. If you want to outright escape and avoid harms, you will likely have to find yourself disconnected from the work, which is not something that we want to do. So what is emotional harm reduction? Emotional harm reduction is the practice of applying the principles of harm reduction towards the self, and also an understanding that the self refers to individuals, teams, organizations, and society. You can see that the work elicits psychological injury as a result of profound loss and sustained or heightened anxiety. Moral distress and subsequent residue can forever alter our ability to manage stressors. So how do we actually mobilize emotional harm reduction? Well, you can mobilize it towards the self by being intentional about seeking support networks and in turn being prepared to reciprocate. You can mobilize it by looking for tailor-made strategies that reflect your individuality, centering on solidarity and compassion towards yourself. You can also mobilize emotional harm reduction with your team that you work with on a daily basis by fostering a culture of community care, patience, and camaraderie. You have to understand that moral distress arises from feelings of helplessness. It's important to make space for direct action. It's important for people to have the opportunity to know that they can do something right here, right now, that's going to help someone. I'm very reminded by a quote one time from Dr. Bernie Pauly when I was particularly frustrated with the system that we work in. And she said to me, "Corey, nothing you do will change the system overnight, but everything you do today will help the people." And that's something that I remind myself on a daily basis, especially when I'm finding myself feeling very frustrated and helpless. You can also apply emotional harm reduction to your organization, because harm reduction challenges policies and procedures that create harms. You need to apply that lens and set your sights on your own organization. Audit for inclusion, representation, and oppressive practices that exist within your own workplace. And of course, you can also apply emotional harm reduction to society, because capitalism, white supremacy, colonization, racism, and misogyny permeate our society. There's also concerns with precarious funding, which breeds unnecessary competition and infighting. And of course, as we know, and as we will continue to review, harm reduction is rooted in social justice, not lateral violence. And so it's important to understand where we need to be setting our criticisms on. We're also going to talk about some of the individual factors that can contribute to stress, to anxiety, to panic at work, to trauma. And one of the most prevalent and common themes is grief. As I've said, many of us work in harm reduction because of a personal attachment to the work. That personal attachment also comes with grief and loss, a phenomenon that looks differently to each and every one of you. Grief is complex and non-linear process. It is a unique experience that cannot be bypassed. Avoidance will feed grief, and grieving is misunderstood by many. It is inconvenient to all, including the person who experiences it. Grief will surface when you least expect it, and your grief is real, and you deserve to heal in your own way, in your own time. However, we don't often have the time and the ability to grieve as we should, because we are in a state of reactivity. In harm reduction, we are always mitigating the harms caused by bigger and better resourced systems. And what that means is that we're always playing catch up. We're always responding to a trend that's already started, which means we're always going to experience loss. And grief is an unfortunate reality of the work. We also talk about the window of tolerance, and it's important to talk about this because while I'm no pro at self-care and I'm no pro at individual approaches to emotional harm reduction, I have been able to find some tips and tricks on how I can self-regulate and bring myself back to a place of rationality. The window of tolerance essentially looks at what happens when we experience hyper or hypoarousal, when we enter into places that are outside of our comfort zone. And it helps us identify what we're feeling, when we're feeling it, so that we can mobilize immediate coping skills and bring ourselves back to that optimal zone. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, because this presentation is divided into different spheres and perspectives. We're starting out with the individual and how to apply emotional harm reduction to yourself, which is honestly the hardest part of all of this. I can't tell you how many times I've said, I'm really great at helping others, but honestly, I'm pretty shitty at helping myself. And that's because this is, for many, the hardest part of their work. So we'll talk about the window of tolerance and how to use it. We do talk about the fight, flight, and freeze response and how to self-regulate. Self-awareness is the foundation of being able to practice these grounding exercises. What you see on the screen here is 4 ways to use your window of tolerance. So if you start to become aware and you start to be able to recognize the symptoms of exiting your optimal zone, you can also be able to flag for yourself when it's time to engage in some grounding exercises. You can also identify early indicators so that you can stave off anxiety before it becomes too severe. You can use your window of tolerance to better respond to crises and conflicts at work. You can learn how to ride the waves when you are in the optimal zone and capitalize on your work. Now, in addition to this, it's also important to understand what's happening within our bodies when we're experiencing acute panic or anxiety. This is the fight, flight, or freeze response. The fight response, in the case, if you are out there in the world and you encounter a bear, what you'll do is you'll stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight, flight, or freeze response. You'll experience a rush of adrenaline and cortisol. And all of this is your body helping you prepare so that you can overcome some kind of adversity, so that you can take on a challenge that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So this fight, flight, or freeze response may seem inconvenient, but it's actually incredibly important. This is your body telling you that it is doing everything it can in order to mobilize coping skills, in order to amp up your oxygen carrying capacity, to heighten your senses, all the things that you need to do to respond to crises. Now, there is no one automatic response that is better than the other. In fact, it is all your body doing what it thinks is best in order to take care of you. When you find yourself in this status for a prolonged period of time is when you can start to experience some health issues, and then you can start to experience some of the collateral damage of the work that we do. And a lot of this collateral damage can include immune imbalances, frequent illnesses, chronic fatigue, hypervigilance, chest pain, insomnia, nutritional deficits, impulsivity, depression, isolation, and so on and so on. And these are things that we need to find ways to regulate, and we need to find our ways to bring ourselves out of this hyperarousal zone so that we can avoid some of these longer term impacts. However, ways that we respond to the immediate, to the acute, are not permanent solutions. They're not things that will resolve the underlying problem or the reason why we're feeling that to begin with. They are, in essence, emotional and mental health first aid. We all experience some form of trauma, and the important takeaways is that my trauma is not your trauma, is not the other person's trauma next to you, and that it's really, really problematic to try and compare traumas with people. Trauma is a subjective experience, much like pain. It can be something very clear-cut, like the loss of a loved one. It can also be social defeat at a young age. It is in the eye of the beholder. However, trauma is produced either through acute and intense experiences or through prolonged stress, fear, and perception of a threat. And so it's really important that we understand trauma and what happens in our bodies when we're experiencing it, so that we can be better at trying to recognize indicators that we need intervention. This is another one of those short-sighted slides that you'll see people often advise. It is important to be able to address the immediate, and it is important to try and engage in some of these activities so that you can avoid prolonged stress and anxiety. However, it's not going to resolve the reason why you're feeling that way. It could reduce the severity of acute injury, and challenging negative thought patterns is incredibly important, especially if you're finding yourselves in that hypoarousal state. The intention and the goal of engaging in one of these 4 exercises here is to find a way to get back to the optimal state of your window of tolerance so that you can rationally think your way through a problem. But like I've said, it does not solve the underlying issue. What is important for everyone to say, and I'd love it if you could all say it out loud right now, is to never forget that this is bigger than you. The issues that you're encountering, the experiences that you're having, this is bigger than you. And so it's okay for it to be challenging and overwhelming. It's also important to remember that this is rarely about you. Truthfully, oftentimes this is about bigger issues. This is about the people that you're working with. And if you can try to find a way to uncenter yourself from the issue, it can be incredibly helpful. It's also important to remember that you are not responsible for the traumas of the ongoing war on drugs. You do have value, you can have bad days, and you can even get sick, and that's okay. It's important to talk about moral distress as well and moral residue. We often find ourselves here working in harm reduction because we are doing our best to reduce the harms while simultaneously feeling helpless and outmatched against a system invested in upholding the war on drugs. Where we find ourselves is in the middle, where you're doing your best, but you know so much more needs to be done. This is what precipitates the cycle of inaction. This is what immobilizes you and keeps you from being able to do the important work that you need to do. And why do we find ourselves here? Well, as we'll learn in the next slide, it's rarely your fault. And in fact, I like to use the crab bucket analogy because we all find ourselves in this bucket. And if you ever were to see crabs put in a bucket or a bowl and they try to escape, the others will pull each other down. And this crab mentality is actually what happens in the non-for-profit world. It's what happens when funders and governments dangle precarious funding over top of our heads, or short-term pilot studies over our heads. It's an unnatural state, wondering when you'll get your next funding, what will happen to your participants if you're not funded again. And what that breeds is competition and undermining and infighting. And that's actually not how we should be doing this work. We need to have solidarity with each other, but being trapped in these precarious funding cycles is not a natural state for us. And so if we had the ability to do this work without that dangling over our heads, without government influencing us and challenging the values that we do our work with, then we wouldn't actually be in a state of pulling each other down. So who's really responsible? Well, like I said, precarious funding is an issue in pilot studies, but also incrementalism and half measures. We see this all the time, where a lot of us understand what we need to do, how we should resolve issues, that it's clear cut that the experts, the people with lived and living expertise have said time and time again, we need to do this so that we can get out of this toxic drug poisoning crisis. And yet it doesn't happen, or what we get is a half measure, a compromise. And that's incredibly harmful, because what you see is what's actually happened here in British Columbia with Safe Supply is that we don't really have a safe supply. We've got a safe supply on paper, but it's not accessible. And that's all people who want to detract from and argue against safe supply really need, so that they can continue to oppose this practice. They need to be able to say, look, it didn't work. This was an ineffective approach. Even though it's not what we asked for, now we're at the biggest risk of losing it. Who's really responsible is, in fact, our leaders, who spend more time pointing at each other and scapegoating each other than actually working in a collaborative way to get out of this crisis. So I want to take a brief pause here and ask everyone to join in on the chat. And if you don't want to, please don't feel like you have to. This is a reflection activity. But have you ever experienced moral distress arising from your personal values conflicting with your work? Have you ever resolved this crisis without actually having to leave your work? And how do you resolve long-term moral residue? I'll give everyone a moment here, and perhaps I can fill in with a little bit of my personal experience. And my personal experience right now comes from the work that I do right now with Safe Supply. I know for a fact that we need an accessible, non-medicalized safe supply. And I'm actually the clinical lead of a medicalized safe supply program. And so what that means is I spend all my day working at the intersections of addiction medicine, which I've been very vocally opposed to, and harm reduction, and making compromises where I can't move the needle forward. That leaves a moral residue. I still believe that the work is incredibly important, and it doesn't change that for me, but it makes you walk away with this feeling of uneasiness. Am I doing what I should be doing right now? Am I practicing in a way that reflects my values? See that.
Corey, did you want to take a look at the chat there, or do you want me to read them to you?
Why don't you read them?
Sure. Okay. I just wanted to make sure that Christine is that clear about what moral residue is? Maybe Corey, if you just want to kind of like give a brief summation. I'm seeing a lot of people saying sort of yes to the first two. Someone saying I worked acute inpatient psychiatry. The moral distress was that they are not harm reduction focused. I now work in community doing harm reduction specific work. Yeah, seeing a lot of yes to 1 and 2. For number 3, reflection and challenging for my personal values for sure, but it depends on the depth of the issue. Someone saying they had good clinical supervision from an outside agency. Some folks have had to leave jobs to resolve their moral distress.
Yes, that certainly is a common trend and something that I too have engaged in as well. I recall returning to Victoria after working in Alberta, and the first job that I took was the team lead of a medical detox program. And I had it in my heart and my mind that I would be able to change that program so that it was less oppressive and that it was more focused on harm reduction. And after months of beating my head against the wall and learning that the people above me weren't really invested in making those changes, the only option that I really had to preserve my ability to do this work was to leave. And I'm hearing from folks that the concept of moral residue may still be a little bit murky. And essentially what moral residue is what happens after experiencing moral distress, what stays with you, how long it stays with you, that feeling that you have compromised your values and your beliefs and changed somewhat as a result of that moral distress.
I also have a nice quote here. So much moral distress, especially working in the shelter and supportive housing fields. And yes, I have resolved this distress without leaving my work. I felt it was important to remain an advocate. Part of my strategy was to create allies to leverage changes. And a couple of other people are saying like focus on building connections, getting together and standing together with allies.
These are great. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing.
Great.
All right, I'm going to continue on.
Sure.
Maybe, there we go. So when we're talking about the individual approaches to emotional harm reduction, we're going to reflect on principles of harm reduction, because as I said, you need to apply these principles inwardly. You need to apply them to yourselves and to your team. And so principle 5 of harm reduction is committed to meeting people where they're at, without judgment, without use of stigmatizing language that perpetuates harmful stereotypes and creates barriers to health. Harm reduction is concerned about quality of life for everyone, not necessarily dictating practices or expecting someone to do something that worked for you. So when we talk about this, it's important to acknowledge that burnout language itself can be incredibly stigmatizing. There is an obsession in this sector with working too much and shaming those who will experience burnout. There's also a trend of experiencing disposability. That is that you can work really, really hard and then you can fall apart and then you will disappear and somebody else will step into your role. And a lot of people who work in the sector experience this. And that's because the work is never done and because you are never resourced enough to do it. And that breeds exceptionalism. It makes you feel like you need to continue to operate at a level that is not sustainable. And to not do that is to experience great shame because you're letting people down. But truthfully, you don't have to. And when I worked in Edmonton in my first job as a street nurse, I remember one shift that I was incredibly unwell and had a really bad cough. This was pre-COVID, so people cared less about that apparently. But I walked up the stairs and one of the nurses that I worked with said to me, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Well, the clients that I work with, you know, they need me." And oh boy, what a silly thing to think, and how seriously I was taking myself, when in truth, I needed a really stern reality check at that point in time, that I was taking myself too seriously and that I had centered myself in the work instead of the participants and instead of the clients. What we really need to do is unconditionally support each other and take care of each other and say, if you need to take time, if you need to be off work, how can I support you to do that? So we'll be moving on now to talking about team approaches to emotional harm reduction. It's time to remove ourselves from the individual and from understanding why this work can be harmful, which is a bonus for me because I'm certainly a learner still in that process. And now we're going to talk about how teams, organizations, managers, and leaders can participate in emotional harm reduction and work to keep each other out of that fight, flight, or freeze, and to find a reprieve from prolonged stress, grief, and anxiety. It's important to acknowledge that when you find yourself saying there's nothing we can do, ask yourself, is this actually grounded in reality? That moral distress and subsequent moral residue that people experience, as I've said before, arises from a feeling of helplessness. So what can you do as a team, and what can you do to support your team so that they can escape that feeling of helplessness? Last October, the team that I work with at the Safer Victoria initiative was incredibly concerned about overdose risk in the homeless encampments in Victoria. We were all already working and our job wasn't to do this, but out of that fear, we decided to set up a temporary unsanctioned overdose prevention site in the busiest park. And while it was additional work, what it actually did was it reinvigorated people. It energized them because they actually felt like for a moment that they were able to engage in some form of direct action. And this is really important, that, you know, a lot of the people that we work with, yourselves included, to them, the work is actually grounding. And to be able to do that work and to know that you've been able to do something, even a small thing today, is something that can help stave off feelings of burnout. It's also important and to make sure that you're never underestimating the power of debriefing and having regular check-ins with your team. It's important that when we're doing that, from a programmatic standpoint, you also need to be consistently seeking feedback from the people you're actually designing the programs for, not in a manner that is checking the box after the fact. When I was working in Topaz Park, there was a time where the decision had been made to move people out of the parks and into the hotels. And that was an incredibly harmful and traumatic process. And I recall being invited to the meeting so that we can start the process of triaging and assigning people to different rooms. And I asked the organizer, I said, like, how many people do you have in this committee that have actual living experience of homelessness? And she said, we've got lots of people with lived experience. And I said, no, the people who are actually in the parks, are they being asked where they want to go? And I was met with dead silence because they hadn't considered that, nor did they decide to invest in actually asking people what they needed. And so I removed myself from that committee, but that's a small example of how a lack of meaningful engagement with people who are actually impacted by programs can cause failed programs and can ultimately lead to more distress and more moral residue. The next principle of harm reduction that this is centered on is that people who use drugs or used drugs must be involved in designing, implementing, and evaluating programs and policies that serve them. Meaningful involvement of people who use drugs in designing these programs is centered on the concept of nothing about us without us, which is a commonly used phrase that affirms that people who use drugs are the experts in reducing harms associated with substance use and with the war on drugs. There's a poll that just popped up in the middle of my screen.
Sorry, Kari, keep going. We'll share the results of the poll later.
Okay, sounds good. So one of the biggest tips and one of the biggest learnings that I've had from trying to engage in emotional harm reduction is that you need to support your team by making space for direct action. And so this is another, I wonder if this will even work on Zoom, but we'll try. Oh, it does. So during the heat dome in BC, our team put together cooling stations in the middle of downtown Victoria, and it had nothing to do with safe supply, even though that's like our mandate and what we are funded to do. And the reason why we did that is because people were really concerned. They were experiencing moral distress out of not knowing what was going to happen to people who had no shelter and had no options to access cooling stations. So part of self-care, part of emotional harm reduction was actually finding ways to make space so that staff could set that cooling station up. The next activity we have here, just some reflection questions, is have you recently found yourself in a panel or committee talking about a group of people who are not actually represented in that panel or committee? And the second question is, do you feel safe giving feedback to your supervisor or manager?
Just so folks are aware, we will relaunch the Zoom survey. It just like launched because one of our computers froze. So apologies for that, Corey. I do see a lot of yes and yes answers to your question. To number two, yes, so they're not convinced that the results in involvement of the group of people, in involvement of the group of people who they're speaking about. A lot of yes and yes. Yes to number one, frequently encounter this and always bring this to group with mixed responses. What else is coming in here? Yes, and the outcomes were bad/not able to understand the needs of the folk.
I see Haley said, I feel safe giving feedback to my supervisor. However, sometimes it takes weeks or months to make change. That in itself can be incredibly difficult. And that's why in that slide, I had notes on making sure that you have action items and making sure that people know that there's going to be a follow-up. It's really frustrating to take place in meeting after meeting and talking about things and knowing things that need to change and not having any kind of timeline of when it's actually going to change, or if any of the feedback you gave was even noted.
Yeah, management is open to hearing feedback, but the director willingness to actually implement is another story. Yes, yes, but the spaces you're holding aren't accessible to the folks you're serving many times, including time of day, the reliance on technology, the pay being quite slow. Ooh, and number two, oh yeah, a yes number two, but they're fearful of being labeled as a troublemaker by others in the system or other folks they work with as well. Yeah.
Great.
Oftentimes my team organization deal with issues quickly and thoroughly, but when funders or larger health authorities are involved, things stagnate.
Yeah, that's a universal sentiment right there when funders or health authorities get involved. So we're going to move on to talking about organizational approaches to emotional harm reduction. And these are important questions. If you're a manager of a program, these are important questions to use to reflect on your own practices. And I will say again that this slide and any of the slides in this PowerPoint are not indicators that myself or the organization that I work for are nailing it. In fact, they are constant reminders of areas where we need more improvement on. The first of these organizational approaches includes having a committee of people who use drugs, advising on policy, a committee that is representative, a committee that is compensated for the time and for the efforts that they put in. Do you have a diversity, equity, and inclusion team? And has it accomplished anything? It needs to do more than just establishing a committee. People need to feel like there are discernible action items that are coming out of these groups. what steps have been taken towards decolonization and decolonizing the practices at your organization. Does your organization support regular training and continuing education? A lot of times people experience that prolonged stress and burnout and emotional exhaustion because of a feeling of stagnation. And so what are you doing to support your staff so that they have regular opportunities to seek out education and continue to grow within their role? This is an infographic that was developed when I worked for BC Campus on the Provincial Peer Training Project. And within the Provincial Peer Training Project, we essentially collaborated with and engaged with over 250 people with lived and living experience of substance use or mental health within the continuum of services of mental health and substance use in British Columbia. And we learned from them and tried to adjust and adapt our way of doing things based off of the feedback that we received from them. And so these were the top 10 lessons that we learned. And while it says that this is for meaningful engagement and consultation, these are actually principles that can be applied to any harm reduction organization. The first is to adopt a set of principles and values and acknowledge that traumas have been generated by well-intended initiatives. Adopt values and underpinning principles that hold your project or your program accountable. Number two is to reflect on your own processes, and reflection is uncomfortable but necessary. You have to examine the policies and procedures within your program and identify areas that need to be changed. Number three is to review the literature. Peers have paved the way in developing things like engagement and consultation recommendations, but also employment standards. These have to extend beyond scientific databases, and we have to seek out publications by people with lived and living experience. The next lesson is to make sure that you're paying people for small asks, for big asks. Always pay people with lived and living experience for their contributions. Follow provincial peer training guidelines that exist. There's one from the BC CDC on peer payments. You need to challenge power structures and create opportunities for people with lived and living experience to lead projects, to lead programs, to have experiences of leadership within your own program. Support peers to take on co-chair roles or leadership roles, and above all else, trust their experience. You need to make sure that you have options for everything. One of the things that we encountered in the Provincial Peer Training Project was that people with lived and living experience often are in different situations in terms of how they would receive payment, and there needs to be options on how to pay people, because some of them may be, more benefited from being able to receive a salary, while some will benefit more from an honoraria and cash in hand. And you need to be flexible. You need to be iterative. You need to be humble in your approach. You aren't actually the expert, and you will be wrong, and that is okay. You need to be able to adapt to feedback. You need to be intentional about seeking diversity and understanding that underrepresented communities should be prioritized and barriers to the involvement should be addressed accordingly. You need to understand that process over outcomes is incredibly important, and that your outcomes are null and void if your process is harmful, tokenizing, or oppressive. And lastly, we hear this all the time, is we need to make sure that we're meeting people where they're at, both literally and figuratively. We need to seek opportunities to learn how other programs and organizations are investing in their work, and how can you make sure that you are not forcing people to come to you and adapt to your processes. The ninth principle that we're going over today is that harm reduction challenges policies and practices that cause harm. Harm reduction is a liberation movement, and we must not forget that as they continue to co-opt, mainstream, and sanitize all the radical social justice out of us, harm reduction is not just a public health intervention, but it's a radical critique of the way things are. Our final activity for the day is, have you ever been told, sorry, it's just our policy? Have you ever felt as though your organization or program has compromised its values at the behest of a funder? This is something that I find incredibly challenging and difficult. I work in collaboration with a lot of organizations, and one of the things we've learned about paying honoraria is that it's honestly best practice to pay people upon completion of the work, and that sending them a check for payment 6 weeks after the fact is not helpful, and it's not what people actually need. And so I've talked to these organizations about setting up a system so that they can pay people as soon as the work is done, even through electronic fund transfers or some kind of thing that can make sure people get paid in a more timely manner. And I'm repeatedly told, sorry, that's just not the way that our program works. Sorry, it's just not our policy. Sorry, we're not set up to do that. And the truth is that it's really easy to send an e-transfer, and it's actually really easy to change your policies and your procedures. It's a lack of willingness to do so that's the biggest barrier. So I'll take a pause here and just see if there's any mentions in the chatter.
Absolutely. I think for me personally, on number one, have I ever been told for a sister policy? Absolutely, many times. And then how many times have I had to repeat this phrase to so many people that I've worked with? It's actually really grating on the soul. I see a lot of people saying yes and yes, 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 yes. Yes, and I have even heard myself saying those words to defend what our organization does. It feels, quote, dirty. And yeah, every single day to number two. Yes, it brings a lot of stress, especially around the money piece. Lack of willingness to change, punishing people who challenge these policies, being worn down by asking for change again and again. I also think most funders do not have this limitation, just the agency often assuming that they do have this limitation.
Yeah, those are really great comments. And I just noticed that there was also a question in the Q&A section.
If you
didn't want to lose the lead on this. Joanna said, Corey, I appreciate the example you shared about having left a committee that did not align with the principles of harm reduction. And I'm assuming by extension, your personal values. I'm often in a position where I feel like I don't want to engage in settings, meetings, and committees that don't align with these principles. But I worry that if I step away, someone took the question away from me. But I realize that if I step away, it will be much easier for the group to continue with status quo. Anything you can share about the distress associated with stepping away versus staying at the table to ensure harm reduction principles are considered? Joanna, that's a very important question, and it actually hits very close to home. There are times when it is, not even just for the sake of self-preservation, but also as a statement, it is important to walk away. And in those instances, if you find yourself, say, on a panel about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's all white people, it's probably important to say, no, I will not participate in this for these reasons. However, what that does is it creates echo chambers where people who aren't going to listen to others, people who don't believe that their process is tokenizing, will continue to move about and continue to do the work in a very harmful way. And so this is that moral dilemma, that ethical dilemma that we often find ourselves in. And it's honestly a case-by-case example of when you need to make that decision. And there certainly are times when I've decided to stick it out. It's both gone well and gone poorly. And then there's times where I've known that this is something that I need to step away from and more so preserve my values and being able to speak openly about it too. Oftentimes when you get pulled into a committee, there's an expectation that you're going to toe the party line. And so removing yourself also allows you to speak more openly about some of those bullshit processes.
Yeah, there's some great comments here I'll read out. I've been fighting to improve my organization's fiscal agents' peer payment processes for years, and they have only improved incrementally. We are constantly stuck wanting to genuinely engage with, quote, consumers, but not feeling comfortable asking for their expertise without a policy to acknowledge and pay for their expertise and contribution. I am not convinced organizations need a new policy. We pay elders all the time. We need to help with paperwork for them. This can be a contractor payment. Yes and yes. And as someone who has tried hard to change policy around honorariums and succeeded in terms of being able to pay cash, The e-transfer issue is a no-go with the health authority I work with because of the high rate of fraud with e-transfers, but super frustrating nonetheless.
Excellent commentary.
Corey, there's also another question in the Q&A if you want to take it at the end, like we can hold it off until the end. Is that more just so you can finish your presentation? You're almost there, Ernie.
I've pulled it up anyways. Any suggestion on how much people who use drugs should be compensated? I was offered $50 an hour for a talk on language and stigma to public health in Nova Scotia. I'm assuming I've seen people offered much more, also much less. You, as a person with lived and living experience, have just as valuable of an education as people that they bring into panels and conversations about, with their PhDs and with their degrees. I once had someone with lived and living experience tell me that they earned their PhD and that it cost them a lot more than anything that I could have received at university. And organizations and funders and groups that put together these conferences and these panels need to be reminded of that on a regular basis, that pay should be equitable, that those should be considered comparable experiences, and that there shouldn't be this this wage gap that exists simply because someone doesn't have a bunch of letters behind their names. It's you that we need to learn from, not the other way around. So at long last, talking about systems level change, and essentially what this is all about is emotional harm reduction is also about making sure that we acknowledge that there are many forms of oppression that exist, and there are some that we have the ability to act on, and there are some that we have the ability to stand up to, and that advocacy is incredibly important. And for many, advocacy can be a form of emotional harm reduction. And so if you're a leader in your place of work, if you want to support your workers and if you want them to experience less moral residue, then you need to back them, and you need to support them when they want to engage in advocacy. You need to be able to stand behind them and support them in whatever the endeavor is, because it's incredibly distressing when you are trying to speak up for what's right, and then you're told that you need to be quiet or that you're going to upset a funder. And so that's one important tip to take away. I made this graphic here as kind of a way of summarizing 7 different steps to invest in emotional harm reduction and things that you can do in the here and now in order to get a little bit closer to reducing the harms of the work that we do. And the first is to intentionally seek out solidarity. This revolves around the individual approaches to emotional harm reduction. How can you seek out people to be around who understand what it's like to do the work? I recall in my most recent experience of needing to take some time away that I at long last sought out a counselor. And I went through 3 different counselors, and in all 3 of them, I had to explain to them the work that I did, why it was traumatic, and why I was feeling the way I did before I was even able to get some help. And if you're going through that process and you feel that disconnected to the person you're reaching out to, then it's not going to be a good fit. And so I also don't want to bring this home to my family and, bring this on to my children and my partner. And so I need to have some kind of team, some kind of group that I can experience solidarity with, who understand and can validate my experiences. It's also important to make sure that you're continuously practicing those grounding techniques so that you can stay in the optimal zone of your window of tolerance, to make space for direct action. Direct action is one of the few ways that we can scrub that moral residue that people experience. Number 4 is to celebrate together, and really important to practice consent before sharing information with people. I had a period of time a few months ago where I actually avoided a couple of people that I work with because every time I saw them, they gave me bad news. Every time I saw them, they let me know about another person who had passed away. And just the sight of them elicited fear from me. And so I found myself taking the long way around the hallway so I could avoid seeing them. And so what I'm working on, one of the lessons that I've learned and that I'm continuing to try and practice, is to ask people if it's okay to share that kind of information and see if they're in a place where they want to hear that kind of information before unloading. Number 5 is to audit your organization for power imbalances and oppressive practices. Number 6 is to challenge what you can, acknowledge what you can't, and understand the difference between can't and won't. And number 7 is to seek heavy feedback and sit with your discomfort. that you really need to understand what people are saying to you, even if it's not something that you want to hear or not something that you're proud of hearing. That is going to be the only way that we see true and meaningful change. So the last principle that this reflects on is that harm reduction is rooted in a commitment to social justice. And that concludes today's presentation on emotional harm reduction. I'm really grateful for the people who joined us today. Yeah, thanks for all of your great contributions and questions. We have time now. I'll stop sharing my screen. After there's a couple of resources here that particularly things like the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit and mindfulness training about a window of tolerance that I would recommend people look at. And then just a reference page so you know I did my homework. And
I'm sure you did your homework, Corey, no doubt. So we will open up for question and answer for the last sort of 10 minutes of the session. But what we will do is I'm just gonna quickly share my screen just to show you a little bit more about how you can get connected to us. There we go. Can everybody see this? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So come and register with us. If you haven't already joined the National Safer Supply Community of Practice, you can join as a member. You'll have access to our newsletter. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We have a pretty lively presence on all of those platforms. I also wanted to tell people that we do have an upcoming public event. So we're just in the planning stages of confirming a panel exclusively of people who use drugs. And it's going to be about safer supply. So stay tuned. The registration link, the event details, the speakers will all become clear in due time. So please stay tuned. And I also wanted to give out, this is our members only event. So for folks that are members, they do get exclusive access to these events. So one of the main ones coming up is December 16th. So it's a prescriber panel discussing the tensions of providing a medical model of a safer supply from a harm reduction approach. That's December 16th at 12 p.m. EST. We also have the prescriber consult line that is exclusively available to prescribers who want to consult with another prescriber about their best practices. We're also going to have Safer Supply 101 role-specific workshops that are coming up, and lots to come. I see that there is probably a bunch of questions, or maybe there's not, I don't know. Lots of resources are being shared by my wonderful colleagues. I know that your PowerPoint, Corey, we're going to be putting on our website as the recording. We'll also take the chat from this conversation and we'll do a summary of notes. So any resources that were shared, we're going to include those as well and circulate them. I'm just trying to be sure if I'm missing any of the questions. I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen so I can better see. I don't see any new questions. I'm just going to double check the chat here. Yeah, I just hear a lot of thank yous, which is lovely. Oh yeah, the other thing is to do is the poll. Welcome back to the poll. So please, we'll leave it up for much longer than we did. If you don't mind filling this out for us, it's really, really helpful. It really helps us to understand how many people are using the French transcription, the closed captioning, etc. What else do we have here? So please, if you don't mind filling out that survey for us. I also really wanted to acknowledge that IKEA was supposed to be here with us today, and we're sad to not have them in our presence today. They're actually practicing emotional harm reduction, and I think that that's like perfect for this webinar. And so I'm sending them lots of comfort and love and joy, and really hopeful that they're going to be able to join us sometime in the future for another panel or webinar. I also wanted to let folks know that we have an attendance certificate. So for anybody that wants to get a certification to attest for your presence in this webinar, there should be a link coming at you real soon. All you have to do is put in your name and your email, and you're automatically going to get a certificate sent to you. Thank you for Tara for having that incredible idea. Yeah, Dawn, you can just click on the link just above your comment there. That'll take you to the Google form. Just fill that out. It'll automatically email you, okay? I see a lot of thank yous, Corey. This is lovely.
Yeah.
A lot of people saying it was really amazing, that you couldn't have articulated it even better. Oh, and for Prime Minister. Oh boy.
What is the community of practice referring to? Did you answer Doug's question?
Oh, I just seen it now.
I think that's a you question, Alex.
Is that a me question? Well, I see all the typing. What is the community of practice referring to? Douglas, the community of practice is the National Safer Supply Community of Practice. It's a new national initiative, and it's a collaboration between 3 primary organizations. So the first being the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs, one of the other ones being the London Inter-Community Health Center, the LIHC, and the Alliance for Healthier Communities. So it's a collaboration between those 3. And then hopefully that answers your question.
The follow-up question was, how does one join the community of
How
practice?
does one join? I think one of my colleagues has already put in a link, but I'm happy to put in a link for you to register up there. I'll pop that in English and French for you.
There we go, the most recent thing right there.
Yeah, there we go. So Douglas, if you go to that link, you can click the join tab at the top right of the website, and that will get you in there. Okay. You can always email us also if you're having trouble finding the right link. That's really sweet. Thank you, Sherry. Fabulous workshop, Corey. You're a superstar with deep gratitude and appreciation. This community is so helpful. We need solidarity and mutual support to survive this. Thanks for the opportunity to debrief the BS. No problem, Shay. My absolute pleasure.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming.
So we'll leave the space open for another 10 minutes. I think maybe I will share the results or close the poll maybe so that folks who are still hanging out with us can see the results. Is that okay? All right, thank you, Paula. Let's share those ladies. Yeah. All right. So this is interesting. Okay. So we've got lots of British Columbia folks, lots of folks from Ontario. What else? Yeah, I think maybe we could cut off the recording. I don't see any necessary need for it. Thanks, Robin.